The light inside Carnegie Hall was soft and gold, just enough to illuminate the elegance without overshadowing the sound. The orchestra was mid-rehearsal, every note crisp, every gesture timed like clockwork. In the midst of this calculated perfection, the heavy doors at the back creaked open. A woman stood there tall, poised cane in one hand and sunglasses covering eyes that did not see. Naomi Rivers didn't wear a badge or hold an invitation. She wore a navy blue coat that had seen better winters and shoes with slightly uneven soles. She walked slowly, each tap of her cane echoing louder than the music itself. A staff member rushed toward her, whispering urgently, "Ma'am, this is a private session. You must be lost." Naomi tilted her head slightly. Her voice was calm, steady. "I'm here for the open masterclass." The man blinked. "The what?" She nodded toward the stage. "Victor DeLaurent. I read he was offering one today." On stage, Victor DeLaurent, world-famous concert pianist, Grammy winner, and noted perfectionist, paused as he caught sight of the interruption. The rehearsal stopped. Silence fell. He walked to the edge of the stage, eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid the masterclass isn't for enthusiasts," he said coldly, sizing her up. "We're not here to teach fairy tales." Naomi didn't flinch. She simply said, "Then you won't need to waste much time." Naomi moved to an empty seat near the side of the hall, folding her cane beside her. She didn't try to explain herself. She didn't beg for validation. Instead, she faced the stage with her chin slightly raised, ears, open hands resting lightly on her lap. The orchestra resumed. Violins climbed, cellos wept. The piano swelled under Victor's precision. But in the midst of this grandeur, one person wasn't watching the maestro. Jake, the assistant conductor barely into his 30s, stood on the far side observing Naomi. Her fingers moved subtly, not to the melody, but to the rhythm. She tapped the beat with the patience of someone who wasn't learning it, but had already known it. Every note that flew across the stage seemed to land somewhere within her posture, her breath, her silence. Jake scribbled something in his notes, then looked again. Who was she? Victor, meanwhile, was too busy reveling in his own composition to notice. The rehearsal ended an hour later, and as the orchestra prepared to leave, Naomi remained seated, still steady, unmoved. She wasn't there to be impressed. She was there to listen. Victor stepped off the stage, ego trailing behind him like an expensive cloak. He grabbed a bottle of imported water and wiped his brow with a handkerchief that bore his initials. Then with a smirk, he nodded toward Naomi and said loud enough for the room to hear. Still here, Naomi nodded once. "Then perhaps you'd like to enlighten us, Miss Rivers," she answered. "Naomi Rivers. Naomi Rivers," he echoed mockingly. "Would you care to demonstrate your mastery?" He gestured dramatically toward the Steinway. "Come show the world your magic." The musicians who hadn't yet packed up stayed in their seats. A few assistants pulled out their phones, hungry for the viral video this was sure to become. A blind woman on stage with Victor DeLaurent. This would be brutal. Naomi stood. She didn't ask for help. She walked with the grace of someone who had memorized the language of floors and footsteps. When she reached the piano, she gently traced the wood with her fingers, her hand resting on the worn edge, like greeting an old friend. No warm-up, no explanations. She sat, adjusted the bench, and breathed in. The room seemed to shrink. No one knew what would happen next. They assumed wrong. Naomi's hands hovered over the keys for just a breath longer than expected. Then they landed, not with hesitation, but with purpose. The first notes escaped the piano like a whisper, uncertain only to those unfamiliar with grief. Her left hand pressed down on deep, aching chords. Her right traced melodies that rose, fluttered, and trembled like a bird struggling to find flight in heavy air. At first, there were a few chuckles, a cough, the subtle rustling of someone zipping up a violin case. But then came the shift, quiet, creeping total. One by one, the musicians stopped moving. The assistants stopped filming. Even Victor, leaning against the wings of the stage, with arms crossed, lowered his head slightly, not in deference but confusion. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't mimicry or coincidence. This was genius, and it was hurting him to admit it. The piece Naomi played didn't belong to any school of music. It didn't mirror Chopin or echo Debussy or mimic jazz or gospel in any obvious way. It was something else entirely haunting and unrepeatable. Notes collided like memory, and regret clashed like shame and forgiveness, then melted into a resolution so tender it was barely audible. By the time her fingers lifted from the last chord, the room was frozen. No one moved. No one dared. A single tear slipped down the cheek of a young violinist in the second row. Jake had set his baton down, entirely unable to stop staring. And Victor stood like a man who had just heard his legacy shatter in the hands of a woman he had mocked. Naomi didn't bow. She didn't wait for applause. She simply stood, gathered her cane, and returned to her seat with the same silent grace with which she had entered. The room remained still. The silence fades not into applause, but into memory. Cut to a flashback, warm and filtered like an old home video, Naomi at 5 years old, seated in a hospital room, surrounded by sterile lights and muffled conversations. A nurse walks in, hands gently resting on the child's shoulders, as the doctor delivers the news: a routine infection, a mislabeled vial, a lifetime of darkness. Later, Naomi is seen sitting on the wooden pew of a small church in rural Georgia, her feet barely touching the floor, her head swaying to the music of the choir. Her mother, a radiant woman with calloused hands and a voice like velvet thunder, sings lead. Naomi listens not with her ears, but with every nerve in her body. She mimics the notes on a worn-out keyboard back home, each key a step in a world she could no longer see. Years pass. Rejection letters pile up on the kitchen table. Juilliard, Eastman, Berkeley. Each response the same. We regret to inform you. Behind the polite wording lay an unspoken judgment. She was blind poor, and from a background they didn't deem classically refined. But Naomi never sought stages. She didn't chase acclaim. Music was a ghost she followed to feel close to her mother, who died when Naomi was 15 from heart failure after years of overwork. Playing piano was never about performance, it was remembrance. Back in the present, Naomi sits silently in the concert hall. Around her no one speaks, but something unspoken lingers in the air: awe, guilt, transformation. She doesn't need anyone to clap. She already knows what her music did. The video didn't start with a title card or fancy graphics. It began with silence, then the soft hum of strings, followed by a blind woman sitting at a Steinway grand. Captured from the far back of Carnegie Hall, the phone footage was slightly shaky, but the audio was pristine. The title posted by the uploader read simply, "The Song That Stunned 1,000 Ears." Within 24 hours, it had over 2 million views. Within a week, 10 million. Comment sections filled with disbelief. Who is she? Why haven't we heard of Naomi Rivers? I've never cried at piano before. But what started as wonder soon turned to anger. Clips of Victor's dismissive tone were reposted alongside Naomi's performance. Hashtags trended globally. Shock or blind, but brilliant. Shock leather play and music without sight. Think pieces emerged overnight on elitism in the arts, on racial and disability discrimination in conservatories, on how many Naomi Rivers had been turned away before cameras ever arrived. Major talk shows reached out. A segment aired on Good Morning America, "Meet the Woman Who Redefined the Stage She Was Never Allowed On." International music festivals extended invitations. UNICEF called asking Naomi to be a cultural ambassador for accessible music education. Still, Naomi remained quiet. She gave only one interview to a local radio station in Georgia. When asked what it felt like to be discovered, she replied simply, "I wasn't waiting to be discovered. I was already here." Back in New York, Victor DeLaurent sat in his penthouse, scrolling through his phone like a man trying to erase a fire with a drop of water. The headlines were merciless. The backlash cut deeper than he would admit. Still, he refused to concede. In a televised interview, Victor attempted damage control. Her performance, he said, crossing his legs with calculated composure, was certainly emotional. But in classical music, we measure more than feeling. Technique matters, structure matters. Emotion without form is a beautiful fluke. The backlash intensified. That same night, Jake, the assistant conductor, who had been silently observing since that fateful rehearsal, published an open letter in the New York Times, titled, "Blindness Isn't the Disability. Tradition is." It read like a manifesto. He detailed the conservatory auditions Naomi was never granted. He revealed how many open competitions had hidden requirements, sight readings, visual cues, elitist expectations that quietly excluded entire groups of musicians. And he called out Victor directly. "You said Naomi's playing was a fluke, but I saw her count every beat in real time with nothing but sound and instinct. That's not a fluke. That's mastery in a language you never bothered to learn." The article went viral. Not as viral as Naomi's music, but close. Within weeks, the conservatory board scheduled an emergency session. Quiet discussions turned into formal evaluations. Was Victor DeLaurent the figure they wanted, representing modern classical education? Had he crossed from iconic into archaic? For the first time in years, the maestro was no longer untouchable. And in the background, Naomi, unbothered by spotlights or politics, continued playing, alone, at peace, and perfectly in tune. It arrived in a thick ivory envelope, sealed with the crest of the very institution that once declined her application without so much as an audition. Inside was a letter, elegant, formal, and riddled with apology, disguised as flattery. Naomi Rivers had been selected to receive an honorary doctorate in music from the Hudson Conservatory of Classical Arts in recognition of her groundbreaking contribution to musical expression and artistic inclusion. She read the letter twice, then set it aside. 2 weeks later, Naomi stood on the same campus where 10 years prior, a receptionist had told her, "We're not accepting walk-ins today." Now she was escorted into a boardroom overlooking the skyline. Deans and donors sat in suits. A photographer hovered near the door, camera half raised. She didn't wear a gown, no speech in her hand. Just her usual composure and a quiet refusal to make this moment about them. When the applause died down, Naomi approached the podium and adjusted the mic. Her words were simple, measured, undeniable. "I'm honored you thought of me, but I won't be accepting this degree." The room shifted, murmurs rising like steam. "You see," she continued, "I never wanted your approval. I wanted access. And there are hundreds, maybe thousands like me who never got it." She paused. "I don't need your stage. I need you to build more of them." Then, without waiting for permission or applause, she handed the microphone back and walked out, leaving silence in her wake and change at their feet. 6 months passed. The posters outside Carnegie Hall bore her name in bold serif letters, Naomi Rivers, Live in Concert. Below it, in smaller print, a benefit performance for accessible music education. Inside the hall, the energy was different this time. Not hushed awe, but reverence. Not spectacle, but anticipation. The seats were filled with aspiring musicians from all walks of life. Some were blind, some in wheelchairs, some had stories carved in languages the classical world had never cared to learn until now. Naomi didn't walk onto the stage alone. Behind her stood the Carnegie Inclusion Orchestra, a group of young musicians from across the country, many of them performing publicly for the first time. They didn't wear tuxedos. They wore what made them feel whole. When Naomi sat at the grand piano, the lights dimmed and silence fell. Not like the first time, filled with skepticism, but with reverence earned through truth. Her fingers found the keys, and together with the orchestra, she began to play. The same original piece. But now it had a name, The Awakening. It soared, it wept, it whispered and roared, backed by strings, wine's brass, and the rhythmic beat of hearts that had waited too long to be heard. The melody unfolded like a revolution dressed in harmony. In the front row, Victor DeLaurent sat motionless. No entourage, no press, just him, humbled, small, and silent. As the final note echoed into the ceiling's golden arches, he stood not to clap, but to cry. No words, no applause cues, just a long, rising silence, a sound louder than fame. The final note of the awakening hung in the air like the last breath of a prayer. The orchestra held their instruments in place. Naomi's hands rested gently on the keys, her head tilted slightly downward, not in exhaustion, but in reverence. There was no conductor's cue, no rush of audience movement, just stillness. Heavy, holy stillness. The crowd remained seated. Then slowly they rose, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. No whistles, no cheers, no ovation. Just a hall filled with people on their feet, eyes wide, hands at their sides. The kind of silence that isn't absence, but presence. The kind of silence that says, "We heard you and we'll carry this." Naomi didn't smile. She didn't bask. She bowed slightly, not low, just enough to show she understood what had been exchanged between stage and seat. Then she turned to her left, picked up her cane, and walked off stage, right, her steps soft, even her cane tapping gently against the floor. Tap, 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 until the velvet curtains swallowed her silhouette. The lights did not flare back on. No one reached for their phones, and still no one clapped. The camera, somewhere unseen, slowly panned across the rows of faces. A child holding her breath, an old man wiping a tear, a teenage boy whispering, "I didn't know music could do that." Then it cut to black. Over the darkness, a voice, gentle, unhurried, without music, spoke the final words. Some songs don't ask for applause. They ask you to listen and remember. Fade out. Roll credits. Silence remains.